why is your 1/4 inch seam so important, and does it really matter if it is a scant 1/4 inch? Well, it really doesn't matter what you call it, but if your seam takes in a full 1/4 inch of fabric, by the time you fold the fabric, it will also take in a little more, and your pieces will probably end up a little too small. Quilt blocks are like puzzles. The patterns are designed so that once you sew your seams, your pieces end up exactly what they need to be. If those pieces end up smaller, it's not all going to come together and fit properly. Some some blocks have more seams than others. Um, all of these blocks have different amounts of seams, so that it's not going to all work out. So, and I'm going to show you some pieces that were all sewn with a 1/4 inch foot and what they ended up, the size they ended up being, because the foot is taking in too much fabric. Here's a flying geese. Here's a rail fence block. Um, and you can see the rail fence is not even square anymore because it has 3 seams going this way and none going that way. So it took in too much fabric, and now it is no longer even square. And you can see how if you were trying to match these in a quilt, that would not work. Or when then, if you're trying to match a piece that has no seams with one that has seams, if you've taken in too much fabric, you've made the piece come out too small. So here you can see the difference, because this one has a seam this way and a seam this way, but it still does not all fit together. So it is very important. If you want, you can see here, there's no way this would work. If you want your pieces to all fit together and your quilt and your blocks all be nice and flat, it is very, very important that you get the correct amount of fabric being sewn in your seam, regardless of what kind of 1/4 inch seam you call it. So these pieces were all made with this 1/4 inch foot, okay? It's got the 1/4 inch guide, and as you can see, you can make little test strips to test your 1/4 inch foot and to get it very accurate, okay? This foot, because it has a hole, if you have a modern machine that you can adjust your needle to work with your foot, that's fine. But this foot does not really allow for adjustment because it only has a hole for the needle. But you can see with this foot, these were 1.5 inch strips, so this space should be 1 inch, and you can see that is not even close. That is a whole 1/8 of an inch shy of 1 inch. So if you use this foot and sewed all your 1/4 inch seams with this foot, your blocks are they're just gonna all be off, and you're gonna lose all your points on anything with points. So I really, this is not a foot I would recommend. This is a 1/4 inch foot with no guide, but this is you use this edge as your guide. So we did the same thing with it, and it's close. It is, it's about a 1/16 of an inch shy of leaving your piece a full inch. Now, 1/16 of an inch may not sound much, but if one block has several seams and another block doesn't have as many, that is definitely a 1/16 of an inch on every seam is going to affect it. Now, this is a this is a 1/4 inch foot, and made for the featherweight. And you could use it on a regular machine, and it does have a slot for so that you could adjust your needle to work with it on your machine to get the perfect seam. On a domestic machine, let's see, this was the one I sewed on with this foot on a domestic machine without adjusting my needle. And you can see it's a little short. It's about a 1/16 of an inch short too, but you could move your needle to make that adjustment. Just remember, if you don't set that as your default setting, every time you turn your machine back on, you're going to have to remember to bump that needle over. Now, this same foot used on a featherweight did give me the perfect 1-inch seam. So I guess it's just maybe the position of the featherweight needle with this foot just is more accurate. The only problem with this foot, so this foot does work really well on a featherweight, and the guide is attached really well so it doesn't wiggle or shift around like some of the guides on some of these other feet tend to have a lot of play in them. The problem is the guide doesn't stick out very far, and when you're kind of looking like this, it's very hard to see that guide. So that is the biggest fault of this foot, is that the guide is hard to see. Now, I do piece on a featherweight, and I really like using a acrylic guide that can be set with two little bolts or screws, so it doesn't shift at all, it doesn't tilt. It gives you a nice guide to keep your fabric against for a distance, which I think helps keep you from, getting off. So this is what I really like to use, but you do have to make sure you have this guide set accurately. Now, they sell a little ideal seam gauge like this. There's several on the market. One just has for a 1/4 inch. I do not recommend it because it is not going to give you the right seam. It is going to give you a seam that is too large, and your pieces are going to be too small. This one has an 1/8 inch, a scant 1/4 inch, and a 1/4 inch. I do use the scant 1/4 inch hole to put my needle into and then bump it and put the guide, but then I still always do a test because there's still some wiggle room and it doesn't always set it exactly in the right place. So I always, if I have to take my guide off, I always do a new test and reset it. I reset it using this, and then I do a test, and if I have to bump it a little bit, I do. So here's one made with this guide on the machine, and as you can see, I have a perfect 1-inch seam. So, my piece ends up, not a 1-inch seam. I have a perfect seam to give me a 1-inch piece. So do some tests, cut you some 1.5 inch strips, and you can even do more than 3 if you want, just to make sure. And it's a good way to practice keeping your seam really nice and straight and not letting your fabric vary at all when it's going through the machine, so that you can get really accurate seams. Really accurate seams are very important if you want your blocks to come out perfect and not have to fudge a whole bunch. There's always going to be a little fudge, and fabric is fabric. It stretches a little, so but you want to keep the fudge factor to a minimum, because when it comes to matching all these kind of things, that is very important. Here is part of a block you can see where if you don't match up real good, see how that looks? And that may not be that much, but with this really dominant fabric up against this, across a quilt, if you keep having those, it is going to affect the overall look of the quilt. The quilt will not look as neat and pretty. So, I think that's about everything I have to say about this. So I just can't stress enough, make some strips, set your foot, make sure, set your foot or your guide or whatever, figure it out to give you the perfect piece blocks that you need, that the pattern calls for. Okay, thank you.